issue about this robbery. I go to Manny, I get the tracking device, the coordinates and the ability to track it, and I start tracking it. He doesn't put that on Red, he doesn't put it on Connor, he doesn't put it on Washington. He says, I'm tracking it from my phone. It'd have been easy if he said, well, I gave my phone to Red and he was tracking it. Or I gave my phone to Connor and they were tracking it. No, he says, I tracked it. Me, myself, and I. I got the coordinates or the ability to track it from Manny, and I started tracking it, but let me tell you who was with me. Eldorado Red was in the back seat. Maurice Connor and DeAndre Washington, they were driving in tandem in a separate vehicle that they had rented. The same vehicle that you saw in the video from Trooper Ryan. So they start tracking this vehicle and ultimately track it, which is consistent. 907, 933 Peachtree Industrial Boulevard. And the reason why that's significant is because at 933, that's when they start tracking it to Peachtree Industrial Boulevard. Look at Connor's records at 948. He is calling Grizz at 948. And every time they start tracking, the phones start to move. And not Grizz's 605 number. It's Grizz's number that was in Little Fat's phone. The 7218 number. That Little Fat had put in his phone a week before the murder. He had met Grizz at Manny's shop and they were just chopping it up outside. Grizz said, hey man, I respect your music, and they exchanged number. And when you put in 1992, the actual passcode to Little Fat's phone, and look through the contact history, and you type in Grizz, that's the number, the 404-468-7218. That's the number that comes up, and that is the number that is in contact with Maurice Connor. So the question becomes, why on earth is Grizz in contact with Maurice Connor on May 6th, May 7th of 2012? Let me tell you something. In his 605 number, he's never in contact with Maurice Connor. Never. And as it relates to the 6th and the 7th, on his 7218 number, those are the only 2 days that he's in contact with this defendant who's driving at a high rate of speed because he has some business to handle on behalf of the mob. No other time will you see Grizz's 7218 number in contact with Maurice Connor's number other than on May 6th and May 7th of 2012. And the whole purpose of that is because they were conspiring to kill Little Fat. They track it again at 12:07 a.m., same place. Then to the murder. On June 7th at 4:05 p.m., Connor's phone is pinging off of just about every tower at the hospital that you can possibly imagine. I think at one point, Special Agent Haran did testify that he triangulated it because there was pinging off of so many different towers and the towers overlapped with respect to Connor's phone. He's there between 4:05 and 6:40. The time of the murder. And let's just talk about these phone records for a minute. I was a little confused, just a little confused. Because during the presentation of the phone evidence, let's just start with Lisa Boylan from AT&T. She is was the custodian of records. And at some point she came in and authenticated the records and said these records are true and authentic and these are the phone numbers assigned to these accounts and this is the subscriber information. All those records will go back to you. And at some point, during the cross-examination, there was an issue about Red's phone, the 1984. And at some point she was questioned about the subscriber information and how that phone actually reflected that the account was suspended on May 25th of 2012. and ask a whole lot of questions about, you don't know who was using that phone after May 25th and how that phone got reactivated, do you? You don't know if it was fraudulently used, do you? And she said, she stood tall. She was like, no, it's not going to switch account holders because that has to happen over a period of time. That time has not passed. But the phone is assigned to the subscriber. And of course, she can't tell you who's using it. But it was interesting how much they went out of the way to try to not put that phone in Red's hand. And the reason why that's the case is because they know that the phone records are damning. And let me just put a side note. They don't want you to rely upon the phone records as it relates to the time of the murder, but when Red is in California and in Phoenix doing his rapping thing, let me tell you something. Guess who has that phone then? Eldorado Red, Gary Bradford, because he was in California and Phoenix. He had the phone in his hand. And there were so many questions that were asked. Well, you can't track the actual person or tell this jury that the actual person was holding the phone. Well, no, I can't say that. But then they would interchange it. Well, where was Gary Bradford's phone in California between May 31st and June 5th? Yeah, it was in California. Oh, it puts him in California. We're good with that. So it's very convenient how they want to literally kind of rely upon phone records when it places them as far away from the murder and the robbery as possible. I think it's important to note that at 1:37 p.m., Connor calls Grizz on the 7th. This is with the 1782 number. He calls him again at 1:56 p.m. And then he calls him again at 2:15 p.m. I think it's also important to note that when these phones and when these defendants are riding together in tandem, and then even at some point when they split up, for example, when they're riding together, the only people that are in contact with one another are Connor and Grizz. No one else is calling each other. Because you got Calvin Johnson, Red, and Grizz in one vehicle, and then you got Main Easy, whose phone we don't know, and you got Connor in the other vehicle. The way they're communicating is through Grizz and Connor. And it's interesting that at the time that they're together, when they're tracking the hospital to the hotel and to the hospital, Grizz isn't calling Red at that time. Grizz isn't calling Calvin at that time. Grizz isn't calling Main Easy at that time. He's calling Connor. He's calling Connor. So look at that and consider that when they are together, they're not calling each other. And the reason because of that, with the exception of Connor and Grizz, the reason for that purpose is because they are together. There's no need to call anybody that's sitting right next to me. I don't have to call Red, who's sitting right next to me, or sitting behind in the back seat. Yo, Red, you see the vehicle? You see him come out the hotel? Is he at the hospital? Bradford's phone is at 401 near the Northside Hospital. I know you heard a lot of testimony about that call. Phone records are able to be tracked or pinged when a call is received, or a call is being made, or something is happening with the phone, like an email is coming across, or a text is being sent. So this notion that, hey, at 401, he's a half mile from the hospital, but that's at 401, and there's this large sector that he could be off the map at this point in time, nowhere near the hospital, in fact. It's just outrageous. It's just outrageous. And let me tell you why. What this reflects at 401 is that is when he used his phone. Had he been using his phone at 3:58, guess where he would have been? He would have been at the hospital. And so when I asked Special Agent Haran, was it consistent with him being at Northside Hospital, he said absolutely. And I'll add, every day, all day, twice on Sunday, because I'm from the Baptist tradition. Absolutely. He was there. And while his phone right now, in terms of direction, is pointing away from the hospital, and the hospital is on the other side of the sector that he's actually in, that just simply reflects that he dropped them off and started to head to Ruth Chris. There's nothing complicated about that. Nothing complicated about it at all. And Connor's there between 4:05 and 6:40. And the iMetrics data supports it. Because on June 7th, after they tracked him from the late hours of June 6th and the early morning hours of June 7th, they take a break and then they start back up again. They start tracking this vehicle. And I think it's interesting to note that there was a lot of resistance even to the iMetrics person. About how accurate it was. And whether, how close you can get. Let me tell you something. The best evidence is to look at the photographs at the hospital. Either the car was at the hospital or it wasn't at the hospital. Let me tell you something. It was off of Hollis Cobb Drive. That's where they tracked it at 3:41 p.m. What's the big deal about the iMetrics person? What's the big deal about the vehicle being at the hospital? Why challenge that evidence? It's because it is consistent with our phone records. And every time they start tracking, they start moving. And then eventually at 3:45, they ultimately track it to Johnson's Ferry Road. At some point, after Bradford and Johnson and Grizz dropped Maurice Connor and DeAndre Washington off, they go have a spade. No big deal. This is what we do. Y'all do whatever it is you got to do. Do it mob style. Do it professional. Don't rob him. We know he's got some money. Do it quick, professional. Get out of there. And then they're eating steak and lobster at Ruth Chris. Like changing underwear in the morning. No big deal. A man's life is in the balance. And they're eating steak. And I'm just as disgusted at Grizz as I am at these defendants. And you ought to be too. After the shooting occurred, they all hook up at Calvin's apartment off of Armour Drive. And there was some testimony literally trying to suggest that they weren't there. And there were some phones pinging and other phones weren't. Well, of course. If the phone's not being used, it's not going to ping off the tower. That's why Kevin Horan gave the hour gap when he actually testified that they are at that location. It's consistent with what Grizz says. It's consistent with what Calvin said. They are there. They are at Ruth Chris eating steak, and it's convenient for them to say, well, Red's just at the mall somewhere. Close to, they keep on throwing out this term, Lenox Mall. Well, Ruth Chris is right by Lenox Mall. It's close to it. But in any event, after they leave Ruth Chris, they eventually go to Calvin's apartment, 415 Armour Drive, and then they eventually end up on Camp Creek. Red was renting out an apartment. And that's when they meet up with DeAndre Washington and Maurice Connor. And they're as happy as they can be. It's important to note that at some point, DeAndre Washington had the spooks a little bit. Insofar as this, when Calvin picked him up from Smyrna, which is consistent with where Connor's records were at around 7 p.m., you heard the defense witness testify, Meadowset, testify that it would take probably about 10, maybe 15 minutes to get up there. I think his phone's up there around, pinging off a tower in Smyrna at or around 7:08. And at some point when Calvin picks him up, because they're trying to dish the car, this guy's jittery. He's got, and that's what happens when you are firing a gun at somebody and you have just killed somebody. He needs to smoke. And then they eventually end up on Camp Creek and they are bragging about the murder. Bragging about the murder. Ecstatic about their accomplishment. They don't even know if Little Fat at this point, because they haven't seen the photograph, they've just kind of done their own kind of an independent investigation as to who robbed them, associated with Little Fat's crew, and at some point Little Fat gets killed, and they're happy about it. They're happy about it. Oh, and make no mistake, we're not hiding from the fact that Manny Chapaya has his own motives to kill Little Fat. But that doesn't mean that Grizz and Red and DeAndre Washington and Maurice Connor didn't have another motive. There can be more than one motive. But he's bragging about the murder and how he's shot him and kept on shooting at him. And I think, according to Grizz, he testified that Maurice Connor eventually said, yeah, he put in some good work. And let's talk about why this is so significant. Connor returns to Alabama that same night. He doesn't waste a lot of time. He returns to Alabama that night. We know Washington returns to Alabama because at some point we hear from Jordan Thomas. Jordan Thomas says that he gets a call from Christopher Davidson, and at some point after that call, he starts to wonder and try to figure out whether or not Little Fat was really killed. And he meets up. That Thursday night that Fat is killed, he meets up with DeAndre Washington, Main Easy, that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And where does he meet him at? On the two occasions, Friday and Saturday, they're meeting outside of the Circle K. Well, is it any, surprise that he has Circle K tattooed on his forearms? And they're getting high. And the first night that they meet him, Jordan Thomas says, look, I just wanted to kind of figure out what happened to Lil Fat. He was a fan of mine. I was a fan of his. And at some point, I just said, man, that's messed up. I think he probably used some other words. That's messed up what happened to Lil Fat. And DeAndre Washington said, no, that ain't messed up. Y'all think it was that Illuminati type of stuff. Didn't have anything to do with Tupac or Biggie. No rapper beef. He got killed because he finessed or flexed somebody over some dope. This is what Jordan Thomas said came out of his mouth. But we know he's back in town, so we don't have phone records that place him back in town immediately. But there's no way that conversation exists unless he's in Alabama. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. First two times at Circle K. The next time I think it was at Stephen's house. Red, on the 8th, the day after the murder, he's going to Alabama too. Hell, I need to get the hell out of here. It's hot in Atlanta. And I'm not talking about the weather. Because at some point when somebody like Little Fat gets killed, and it's not so much just Little Fat. It's when a murder happens at Northside Hospital. Let me tell you something. People start to pay attention. And not to say that other murders are unimportant, because they're just as important. But eyebrows are raised, red flags go off, and people are going to have to answer, what is the issue with security going on at Northside Hospital such that a murder occurs right outside the maternity ward? So the heat is on, and everybody is getting out of town. Everybody. Grizz travels to Kansas City. The only one that comes back to Atlanta is Manny. As if nothing happened. As if he didn't have anything to do with any of this. Man, what's going on in Atlanta? When he knows he provides the coordinates to permit them to track this individual. And mind you, he tucks tails and runs to Florida on May 7th. He just so happens to create an alibi for himself on May 7th because he flies to Florida. But on the day that he learns that Little Fat is ultimately killed, he returns to Atlanta. Oh, it's over with. Let me go back to doing what I do. Selling illegal cars, laundering money for dope dealers. I think that you heard some testimony through Detective